Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome to the FSX404 channel. Today we're going to finish the 10 most extreme series videos by flying into Lukla Airport. First of all, I want to thank a lot of you guys who have stuck around and made this 2-year project fun. Ironically, Lukla has one of the easiest approaches, or at least easiest to explain approaches. It's a full visual approach, and for visual approaches, a pilot is using his or her judgment. Am I too high? Am I too low? Am I too close to the mountain? Am I too far out? Etc. Most of the approach is a pilot judgment. But first, we need to get to the point where the visual approach begins. There are two ways to get to the point where the visual approach into Lukla begins. The first one is coming from Kathmandu VOR. We'll fly a radial of 096 from Kathmandu VOR. We're going to be at or above 13,000 feet. When we're around 70 miles from the Kathmandu VOR on a 096 radial, we've arrived at the point where the visual approach into Lukla begins. We need to arrive at this point at 13,000 feet. The second way to get to the point where the visual approach into Lukla begins is by flying a radial of 334 from the Baringatar VOR. Again, at the point where it's 70 miles from the Baringatar VOR on a radial of 334, we've arrived at the point where the visual approach into Lukla begins. Again, we will fly this 334 radial at 13,000 feet or above. As we arrive at the 70-mile point from the Baringatar VOR, we will be at 13,000 feet and we will be at the point where the visual approach into Lukla begins. So both Kathmandu 096 radial and the Baringatar 334 radial bring us to the same point at 13,000 feet. And now the approach gets really interesting. At this point where our visual approach begins, this is our decision point. This is where the pilot decides whether to go land at Lukla or not. After this point, it's going to be hard to turn that plane around. It can be done, but it's going to be very dangerous. So this is the point where the pilot has the first go, no-go decision. A pilot has to have a clear view of the whole valley all the way into Lukla. If not, the pilot needs to immediately turn around and go back to where they came from. From this point, the approach is very simple. As soon as we go for the approach, we will begin our descent from 13,000 feet down to 9,500 feet. We'll follow the valley all the way to the point that we turn onto the short final into Lukla. When we roll out, when we're on that final for Lukla, we need to be at 9,500 feet plus or minus 100 feet. We're not going to have too much time on that final approach to make many adjustments. If we're too high or too low, we're going to have a hard time making adjustments to land at Lukla. And at Lukla, there can be no mistakes. So when we roll out on that final, we want to be in a good position to make that safe landing. Now let's talk about a couple of things to notice for Lukla Airport. First of all, the final approach at Lukla is very shallow, more so than at any other airport. The shallow approach is done because at Lukla we cannot be too high. If we're too high, we're dead. The second thing to remember at Lukla is that Lukla runway is sloped up. A runway that slopes up gives the pilot a visual illusion that the plane is higher than it actually is. So on these sloped runways, if a pilot is not careful, he or she will end up being too low, and at Lukla that means you're dead. So we have to keep in mind that the Lukla runway is sloped and it's going to appear that we're higher than we really are. This final at Lukla Airport is all stick and rudder skills. There's no autopilot to help us, there's no auto land to help us, just the pilot and his or her plane. That's it. Now, for this approach, we're going to use a Lago Twin Otter. We're going to be coming from the south, from the Baringatar VOR on a radial of 334, very close to the point where our visual approach begins at 13,000 feet. So let's get inside the airplane and let's fly this approach. Alright guys, we're inside the airplane right now. We're about the point where the visual approach begins at 13,000 feet. Now there's some clouds underneath us, but the rest of the valley is open and it's clear, so we'll go for a landing. Alright, at this point we are over the point where the visual approach begins. We are 70 miles from the Baringatar VOR, and we're going to start our descent down to 9,500 feet. Now we're going to have a little bit of time until we get to the final approach, and we have to concentrate. So let's talk a little bit about this approach itself. As you can see, the approach into Lukla is not that complicated. Basically, we're doing a visual approach, meaning that we're using our own eyes, we're using our judgment to make this approach. So we're gonna ask ourselves, are we too high, are we too low, are we too close to the mountains, and all those sorts of questions, because our eyes are our best friend over here. Now as we're getting closer to Lukla, there's a few things that we have to keep in mind. First of all, one of the most important skills we need at Lukla are stick and rudder skills. And when we're talking about stick and rudder skills at landing, the most important thing we need to know is slow flight. Now I've preached about slow flight a lot in my previous videos. I haven't talked about it lately, but slow flight is one of the most essential skills a pilot can have. Basically what happens during slow flight is that our airspeed we control by our pitch. So we don't use our power to control the airspeed, we're actually going to use the pitch of the plane to control our airspeed. And the thing that controls our altitude is actually our power. So our power settings are going to control our descent and our altitude, while the pitch controls our airspeed. So if we're too fast, we're going to pitch up. If we're too slow, we're going to pitch down. If we're too high, we're going to reduce power. If we're too low, we're going to add power. This is something we refer to as a control reversal. And slow flight has to be something that becomes second nature to us when we're landing a plane. We don't have time to think about it, we actually react to it, because we have to stay ahead of the plane. The second thing we want to talk about at Lukla is staying ahead of the plane. Now for Lukla, we need to stay ahead of the plane, especially with the Twin Otter, the plane we're using today. Twin Otter has about a 2-second delay between when you add the power and when the power kicks in. Same thing when reducing the power, there's about 2-second lag, so we reduce power and about 2 seconds later is when the engine starts slowing down. So we have to stay ahead of the plane and anticipate when we're going to need that power, when we're going to have to reduce that power. This is going to be very important when we get into that last part on that final into Lukla. We have to stay ahead of the plane, otherwise we'll either overshoot the runway or end up hitting the side of the cliff in front of the runway. The third thing we have to remember about Lukla is that the runway is sloped, and that sloped runway is going to give us the illusion that we're higher than we actually are. So we have to be disciplined not to go below the glide slope. Even though the glide slope is shallow at Lukla, we have to be very careful not to hit the side of the cliff by the runway. I know some of you guys are expecting a more sophisticated way to explain this approach, but this is a visual approach. It's very simple. We are using our stick and rudder skills to land here. Before landing here, you're supposed to be familiar with the area. You're supposed to recognize every mountain, every tree, the river, know where you are. And even more importantly, you're supposed to know your plane. You should know how your plane handles, what you can do with it, what you can't do with it, how much power you need to add, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, we're at 10,000 feet right now. Lukla is off to our right side, we can see it. We're descending down to 9,500, and we're going to have to be at 9,500 once we turn out of that final. We're at 9,700, let's turn onto the final slowly. And as we're coming out, we're at 9,500 feet and we're lined up with the runway. We do have a little bit of crosswind, and this is where the power settings are going to make all the change. Let's set our pitch for 70, that's our approach speed. And we're just going to use the power to get us onto the runway. Remember, the runway is sloped, so we cannot be too low. We're looking good right now. We're aiming for the numbers. And there it is, guys. Center line, crosswind landing controls on the ground, and there we are, guys. Again, it's been fun, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around with me for 2 years, and I'll see you guys soon.